Hey guys, it's Libby and we are back for part 2 of my favorite books of all time. So if you missed part 1, I will link it on my face and you can click it and go hear about my first 9 favorite books. And now we're doing the next, 8, something like that. And these are in a little bit of an order. So all of the books in this video you can assume I like at least a bit more than the ones in the last video, but I still like all of those a lot. And true to form, I do not have a physical copy of the first book I'm talking about in this video, but I do have physical copies of all of the other ones in this video, so you will have something to look at other than this. And that's because I read it on my phone in its Kindle edition. That is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. This book and we went on an adventure. It's somewhere around 800 pages long. I spent, I believe it's 359 days reading it. So almost an entire year. And if you're gonna do that, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell is actually quite a good book to do it with. It's fantasy, so you have to kind of wrap your head around their magic system. And it doesn't move through time at a steady pace, it just sort of shows you snapshots of what the important scenes are. So there might be like 3 months that pass between chapters. And it didn't do that epic fantasy thing of having a million characters. There were about 10 important characters that you had to keep track of, and they were all really well defined and different from everyone else. And even if I stopped reading for a long time, as soon as I picked the book back up, I would know exactly who was who and I wasn't lost. This book is in a sort of subgenre known as a fantasy of manners. This is sort of a play on the concept of a comedy of manners, which is the sort of thing that Jane Austen wrote, where most of the characters are upper middle class or upper class, and there aren't ever any like big action scenes. All of the drama comes from the characters' internal struggles. So this book is set in the early 19th century. It mostly takes place in England. We occasionally jump to other countries in Europe. But this is an alternate timeline in which there is magic. But it's kind of inaccessible. It requires a lot of studying. It kind of reminds me of how archaeology was in the actual non-magical 19th century, where like everybody knows that it exists, but very few people are specialists in it, and the specialists all kind of know each other and understand what the others are working on. And so in this world, back in like the Middle Ages, that was known as the Golden Age of Magic. And there are a bunch of big names doing interesting and new types of magic, but at this point, magic has kind of fizzled out, and it's just an academic exercise. There's actually a division between the theoretical magicians who just study it, and then there are practical magicians who do the studying, but then also actually do magic. And when we start out, it seems like there are no more practical magicians left in England. And then it turns out that there is one left, a man named Gilbert Norrell. And he manages to put to shame all of the theoretical magicians around where he lives. And then he moves to London, where he does things like assist the government, especially since this is during the Napoleonic Wars. He also starts an academic journal where he can spread all of his ideas. And then he gets an apprentice named Jonathan Strange. And Mr. Norrell is very much against the concept of the Golden Age. He thinks that all the magicians of that time were actually using magic inappropriately and that we shouldn't aspire to do what they were doing. And Jonathan Strange initially agrees with him because he's his student and he's just sort of accepting whatever Norrell tells him. But then as he thinks about it more, he thinks that the Oriots magicians were actually onto something. And thus begins their strife. So that's the main plot line. There's also a fairly significant subplot. Mr. Norrell brought back to life a young lady who was about to get married to a senior government official. But he needed the help of a fairy to do this. And as fairies do, he makes a request of Norrell in exchange for bringing Lady Pole back to life that Norrell thinks he understands, but didn't quite grasp. And this is kind of making a mess for Lady Pole and her husband Sir Walter and their butler Stephen Black. And I absolutely love this book. I even loved the first couple of chapters, which were a little bit slower. So if you start reading it and you can't get into it, wait until you get to London. And if you still don't like what's going on there, then you can drop it. But I think at that point, like when we meet Sir Walter and the fairy, you will get hooked. The next book on my favorites list is Measure for Measure by William Shakespeare. Am I pretentious enough for you? Because I'm really trying. So Measure for Measure is one of Shakespeare's later plays. It's a problem play in that it's definitely not a history, not really a tragedy because no one dies, but not a comedy because not happy. There is like attempted rape and attempted murder, and it's not fun. But I think it's quite a beautiful story with some really amazing lines. This play is set in Vienna, Austria, which was kind of the Las Vegas at the time. There's lots of brothels and gambling and sin going on everywhere, and it's governed by a duke. And the duke, at one point, realizes that he kind of needs to get his house in order, but he doesn't want to, so he says that he's going to go like on an embassy or on a vacation or something. He leaves for a bit and leaves the city in control of another man named, I can't remember his name, and this is really embarrassing. Angelo, duh, his name is Angelo. And Angelo is one of the most uptight people you will ever meet. So he's like cracking down on sin, I am there. So one of the ways that this manifests is Angelo condemns to death a man named Claudio because Claudio and his girlfriend had premarital sex and now she is pregnant. And so Claudio asks his sister Isabella to go ask for mercy from Angelo. And this comes in just the nick of time because she was about to become a nun, after which you can't talk to men anymore, but she's like, okay, I'll hold off on becoming a nun for just a bit so I can go talk to him, see if he will spare my brother's life. And she shows up and she asks that Claudio be spared, and Angelo says no, but he's like, oh my god, this lady is hot. And I want to do things with her body that I would not write to my mother about. So he says, okay, come back in a bit. And so when she comes back, he says, I will let your brother go free if you sleep with me. And she's like, I don't think I am down with that. And we can have a whole big long debate on whether that is the right answer or not. But that is beside the point. And so one thing that I forgot to mention, but this is not a spoiler, you find out quite early, the Duke has not actually left. He's still in Vienna in disguise, and he's monitoring how Angelo is doing. And so that is where most of the intrigue comes from. Okay, next book. We are ratcheting up the pretension levels, possibly even more, because it is L'Histoire de la Marquise Marquis de Banneville by François Timoleon de Choisy, Marie-Jeanne L'Héritier, and Charles Perrault. In case you didn't pick up on it from the title, this is in French. However, it's really, really short. A lot of this is introduction. It's only like 60 pages long. And this edition is the MLA Text and Translations edition, and so it has an introduction in English and it has notes in English. That's what English looks like. And the French is really not very hard, so if you are even moderately good at French, you can read this in French. If not, there is an English translation. I will provide links to both of these editions. They're Amazon pages because they can be a little bit hard to find. If you need more help, this version, I think both versions were edited by Joan Dijon. Anyway, this is a story that was written in the 17th century, and it is set in the 17th century in the court of Louis XIV. And it starts out with a young couple, the Marquis and the Marquise of Banneville. They're very much in love. The Marquise becomes pregnant, and then her husband goes off to war and he dies. And the Marquise is heartbroken by this, and she's afraid that if she has a son, he will be sent to war as well, and then she'll lose him too. So she determines that if she has a boy, she will disguise him as a girl so that he can never be taken away from him. And as it turns out, it is a boy. So she and her maid are the only people who know the child's actual sex. And then the story picks up when she, I'm going to call her she, is 16, and they start moving around in the circles at court. And it's mainly a love story, so you can imagine what sort of shenanigans are involved there. But actually my favorite part is when the little Marquise is told a story about a boy who, he was at an all-boys school and they were doing some theatrical production and they needed him to play a woman, and he got like really into it, and he like took lessons on how to hold yourself as a woman and how to get your hair did and all that sort of thing. So he did the play, and then afterwards he was like, actually I think I'm gonna keep dressing like a woman, you know? And to this story, the little Marquise says, you know, I don't believe that story. If I was a little boy, I don't think I would want to pretend to be a little girl. And her mom is like, maybe don't judge. Don't judge. And this story is like the most adorable thing ever. So you should read it if you like gender bending, if you like fairy tales, or if you're interested in life at the court of Versailles. Okay, next book is Under the Skin by Michel Faber. I am such a Faber fangirl. I haven't read either of his two like massive tomes, The Crimson Petal and the White, or The Book of Strange New Things, so I will just have to gush about this one. Unfortunately, there is not a lot I can tell you without spoiling it. This is one of those stories where sort of every chapter you learn something new that totally changes your perception. So what happens in the first chapter is there's this lady named Isserley driving around Scotland picking up hot hitchhikers in her car. And the cover with its lovely deltoids and the first chapter and even kind of like the back cover synopsis are trying to make you think that this is a sexy thriller. They put a lot of effort into making you think that this is a sexy thriller, but it is not that. It is, I will tell you that it is science fiction, and I will tell you that it is examining ethics. And that's all I can say. I really, really want you guys to read this so we can talk about it, like actually talk about it. The next book I can say a little bit more about, and that is Thief of Time by Terry Pratchett. Now this book is technically the last book in the Death sub-series of the Discworld series. However, the main character does for the first time appear in this book, and the side characters, Susan appears in the other previous Death books, most of which I hadn't read, and the history monks appear, I think, in Small Gods, which I also hadn't read. And I still love this book, so you don't have to read any other Discworld books in order to enjoy this. So the villains in this book are the Auditors. They say that the universe is 1/10 actual things and 9/10 information about those things, and the Auditors are the ones who keep track of the information. And they are kind of bothered by the fact that this information keeps changing because of, you know, life forms and their irrational wants and their, like, ability to move. So the Auditors decide that they will build the perfect clock. And of course, no clock that has ever been made in Discworld or our world can be perfect. Eventually it will fall a second behind or a second ahead. And so the creation of the perfect clock would perforce stop time and bring about the apocalypse. And so our hero is named Lobsang Lud, and he is in training to become a history monk. Just imagine Tibetan Buddhists up in their plateau. The history monks are in charge of sort of making sure time goes along as it ought. So we hear a lot about him. We hear a lot about Susan Stowe Hellett, who is the granddaughter of Death, don't ask. And most of this book is really good. However, there is one element that I just adore so much that I melt into a pile of gloop in awe, and that is the character of Lady Lejeune. So the Auditors don't have physical form, so they cannot commission a clock to be made. So one of them has to put themselves into a human body in order to commission the clock. And this ends up having unintended consequences. The auditors don't have physical form, they've never been hungry, but when you have a human body, you get hungry. And so Lady Lejeune, she's like, why am I drooling while I'm looking at this delicious steak? I don't understand. She's like, why do I just sort of cross my legs when I sit down? It just doesn't make sense, but it's more comfortable, and so the body just sort of does it. And I love stories like this, stories about becoming human and figuring out what that's all about. Okay guys, we've now hit the big leagues. These are my top 3 books. And this may be a bit of a cop-out, but I cannot decide which of these books to talk about first. They are both by the same author, so I don't think this is cheating. And it is The 13th Tale and Bellman and Black by Diane Setterfield. These are both standalones. They're also the only 2 books that Diane has written so far. She takes an infuriatingly long time to write books. And I guess I'll talk about The 13th Tale first because it was published first. But everyone absolutely loved this one. And then most people did not like Bellman and Black, which I think is completely unfair. And I'm gonna go ahead and say that if you didn't like this book, then you didn't understand it, because it is incredible. So The 13th Tale I talked about in my last wrap-up video because I just finished rereading it, so it'll be kind of brief in terms of synopsis. So let's just say Margaret Lee is a sort of nerdy, interested in classic literature type of gal, and she gets invited to write the biography of Vida Winter, who writes modern novels that she isn't really into, and so she's thinking about declining this opportunity when she accidentally, nothing is accidental, comes across one of Vida Winter's books in her father's bookstore, which really doesn't belong there. So she starts reading it and then completely falls in love. Then she goes to meet Vida, and Vida's not really warm and welcoming and kind. So it takes a bit more work to convince Margaret to write her biography, but eventually she does. And then Margaret gets to hear about Vida's childhood, where she grew up basically parentless in what was once a stately mansion, but as they live in it, it falls into decay. And there is a lot of twin stuff. So if you like twins, read this book. If you don't like twins, read this book, and then you'll think twins are cool for narrative purposes. This book also has the greatest twist of all time. Your mind will be blown. And then there's Bellman and Black, which is amazing in a different way. And I think that's why a lot of people were kind of disappointed by Bellman and Black, because it's not really in the same vein as The 13th Tale. Our main character of this story is named William Bellman. We first meet him in the prologue when he's a child, and he and his friends are like making catapults and throwing rocks and stuff. And then William sees a rook or a crow on a branch quite a ways away, and he says to his friends, "Hey, I can hit that crow." And no one believes it, but he throws this perfect arc and squarely hits the rook and kills it. And this encounter changes his entire future. And this book is completely different from any other book I've read, so I don't really know how to describe it, and I don't really know how to describe what makes it different. I've tried the words fairy tale-like, I've tried the words magical realism, but none of those are quite right, so I think I'm going to go with dreamlike. There's like symbolism out the wazoo. It's also very economical with words. I'm pretty sure that every word in the text is necessary. There's no superfluity. And this sort of leaves you feeling ungrounded. Time passes much more quickly than you feel it ought to do. Like, you'll be reading and then all of a sudden you realize that 40 years have passed while you weren't paying attention. And that's because that's how Bellman is living his life. Like, all of a sudden one day he's old and you don't know where the time went. And I don't even know what to say about this book. Just go read it and then you will understand. Okay, here we go. My favorite book of all time. It's Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. I love this book so much, I feel uncomfortable talking about it. And pretty much all the other books on this list are on it because I think that they are really good books and that everyone should read them. However, with Rebecca, this is just the book for me. I don't expect everyone will love this, and I won't be offended if you don't like it. But if you read this book, you will understand what it's like inside my brain. So I kind of almost don't want you to read it because it feels like if you understand this book, you will understand me too deeply, and it's just an invasion of my privacy. But go ahead and read it anyway, I can handle it. So this book is about our narrator, obviously, who doesn't have a name. I kind of like that about books. She's an orphan and she's working as the companion to a kind of socially inept, not socially like awkward, like little too forward, maybe leave those people alone, American lady, and they're staying in Monte Carlo when they meet Maxim de Winter, who is a bit of a celebrity right now, not only because of his fabulous country house in Cornwall, as Daphne du Maurier likes to write about, but because his beautiful, charming, socialite wife, Rebecca, has died less than a year ago. And Maxim actually treats our heroine like a real person, which is kind of all it takes for her to fall in love with him. And then, like, a bit of a spoiler, but you can see it coming, they get married and move back to his house, Manderley. But our narrator has never been rich, and so she's not really good at being this whole lady of the house. She's not sure what time the rooms have the fires lit in them, and so she doesn't want to like inconvenience the staff by making them light fires at different times. But worse than that is the specter of Rebecca, who's still looming over the house. The housekeeper, Mrs. Danvers, was Rebecca's maid. They'd known each other for a really long time, and she does not think that this new mistress is nearly up to snuff. And Maxim is kind of sucking and not helping her settle in at all. He makes her go on all these social calls to local bigwigs, which she hates. He's never really affectionate, and she feels like he just thinks she's dumb. And so the reason I feel like I have a really personal connection with this book is because it's in first person, and so we spend a lot of time just in the thoughts of our narrator, not even talking about like the action that's going on. And she is incredibly socially awkward. And a lot of her thoughts are about what people must be thinking of her. She constructs these elaborate fantasies where people are like judging her and how she acts and what she wears. And that is what it's like in my brain. For example, if I go to a physical bookstore like a Barnes & Noble, I am kind of afraid to take a book off the shelf and like look at it and read the synopsis if there's somebody else in the same aisle as me, because I'm afraid that they will have read this book and they will have not liked it, and then they will think that I am like stupid or have bad taste. Which is ridiculous, I know, but I cannot get over the self-consciousness. And so this book is about a lot of things, but to me it's mainly about that and dealing with it and overcoming it. So that is why Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier is my favorite book of all time. I will see you guys soon.